Welcome today to the webinar with Nesta UK. We'll be discussing their research on innovation teams in governments around the world and some of the follow-up work they're doing to support this kind of work globally. All right, let me offer a brief introduction to get us going, and then I'll give the floor back over to you.
Right.
So thanks so much for joining us today. We're here with Nesta, which I understand started originally as a government organization in the UK government. It stands for the National Endowment for Science and Technology. Since 2012, though, Nesta has become an independent charity in the voluntary sector, working to become a hub of innovators, doing research on how innovation works, and developing practical tools and skills to share with people who want to solve today's problems with innovation. From our side, most of the listeners today are working throughout the UN development system, innovating in their own ways. We're seeing innovation crop up across the system, across the agencies, across countries. And again, it's usually to solve an intransigent issue that couldn't be solved in traditional means. Let me just skip the intro again and hand over to you, and let's hear about your work.
Okay, great. So my name is Baeck. I'm researcher here at Nesta, and you also got Sophie, who's also researcher at Nesta, and Brenton, who leads our skills team in the room. And what we want to try and do is cover both kind of some insights from our research into our teams, and then Brenton will end it by talking about how we're taking this work further into trying to develop the skills to innovate across governments around the world. So what I thought to do is I'll just give you a kind of quick background about the research and kind of some of the key findings, and then Sophie will take over talking about some of the lessons from the research as well. So the premise from this research is really that although I critique governments often that governments can't innovate, we know that's not true. Governments are behind some of the greatest innovations around the world, from the internet and the World Wide Web to high-speed rail systems and public health systems. However, we also know that one of the common critiques is that where businesses and private sector has managed to kind of embed more systemically R&D systems and teams in labs to focus on driving innovations, those within government who try to innovate often succeed in spite of support from government rather than because of it. Having said that, then one of the things we're increasingly seeing in our work around the world, and hopefully our slides will kind of come through now, is this increasing trends of governments trying to learn from that practice from the private sector around how can government set up its own teams to drive innovation. So together with Bloomberg Philanthropy, Nesta tried to set out the study around trying to understand who are these teams, what do they do, and how do they work in governments around the world, and what is the type of impact they're creating. So we set out with our partners to develop a very long list of more than 100 different teams around the world, and from that we picked a list of 20 which we examined in more detail. It's important to say that these teams exist in governments around the world. From Brenton's made a very good point. I speak very fast with a thick Danish accent, so once I speed up, please do let me know, and I'll try and slow down.
You can definitely slow down.
Great. It always happens when I get excited about the research.
We feel it. So, thanks so much.
So just to quickly say the obvious point, but this is something that happens in governments around the world, from Asia, Oceania, and Australia, through to Europe and the Americas. Interestingly, we struggle with finding good case studies in Africa, except for one in the report, which is TPSI in South Africa. And I guess what I want to kind of try and emphasize is that the idea of iTeams is a relatively new trend, and as you can see from that slide, the majority of teams have been set up within the last 5 to 6 years. However, there are some pioneers in the field, the youngest one, or the oldest one being CISHA, set up in 1967 by the Finnish government, and the youngest one being Open Mexico, set up in 2013 by the Mexican government. Kind of when we started looking through our case studies, it was clear as we kind of started interviewing, I think we interviewed more than 80 people from governments around the world, but there are kind of 6 key trends to these teams and how they're kind of thinking about being successful. The first one is kind of, and that's what we try to study in more detail in the case studies and the report. The first one is around kind of leadership, and that's how the team is led and managed not just from the director of the team, but also the political leadership that sits around that team. So how do mayors, ministers, and so on provide the political support to make the team a success and set it up and implement solutions coming out of the team. Secondly, the team. So how big are the teams? What skills do they need? What are the dynamics? And how do those teams work with other teams across governments? And kind of following on from that, what are the specific methods that they deploy? So often these teams will apply tools and methods that are very new to government, so like service design, ethnography, service user journeys, and so on, to try and get new insights and new ways of understanding public service and the people who use them. Then there's a fourth element, and this is really important, around kind of the resources. So how are teams, who pays for these teams? How are they financed, and how are they measured? And how can we really understand kind of the benefits of investing, often quite significant portions of public money into these teams? Fifth point is around the partnership. So as Sophie will talk about later on, no IT team works alone. It's always around creating kind of the right partnerships across government. So you can bring people in who have deep knowledge of different parts of public services into working with the team to deploy new methods, but also developing mechanisms and functions for taking the solutions and ideas coming out of the IT teams back into kind of mainstream public services. And then the sixth, and this is by far the one that most IT teams struggle with, and I guess most innovators in general struggle with, is impact measurement. How do they evidence that the work they do really drive impact and efficiency within public services? So there were some really tough questions to ask the team, but we got some really interesting insights back from people. And kind of based on all the insights and the different types of teams, we kind of try and see, are there some common threads between the different types of teams and units? And we came up with this framework saying there are roughly 4 types of IT teams. Or 4 roles for the IT teams, and I guess the really good ones do all of this. But when thinking about in the different teams that are in this conversation now, like what you want to do and what you can do, it's often good to ask those questions: what kind of IT team are we? What capacity do we have to act? So the first example is teams that create solutions to solve specific challenges. Monum in Boston is a really good example of this. It was kind of developed after Mayor Menino came into office in 2012, and he was really aware that we don't do nearly enough to work with citizens to create new solutions for the city. So he set up Monum, which is basically a team that sits two doors down from the mayor's office, which has a mix of city civil servants, engineers, and developers who can work with citizens on creating public solutions. So 2 examples of products coming out of that partnership is, one is Citizens Connect, which is an app developed with citizens to map graffiti and kind of stuff around the city, where all you have to do is take a picture of the graffiti on a public space, and it will directly get uploaded to the city so the city can react on it. And the other one, which I think is even more interesting, is how they work with a young mother who has a son with autism on creating an app that helps her better manage her son and her son's condition, but also better share that learning with other parents around the city with autism. And again, this kind of mixing city skills around development and public services with the citizen, in this case, young mother's experience of living life as a carer. The second kind of example is around kind of trying to better engage citizens, and this really builds on the previous example around non-profits to find and develop new ideas. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work done in Seoul by Mayor Park Bong-soon around the Seoul Innovation Bureau, where Mayor Park's big project is to make Seoul the world's biggest, or first and biggest, sharing city. And I think it's quite interesting here how Mayor Park is trying to implement lots of different methods, basically about getting citizens to better share resources with each other, and also get better coming up with new solutions for listening to citizens. So the picture you got on the slide there is a sculpture outside City Hall, and it's supposed to illustrate a big ear. And I guess Mayor Park himself is a pretty good example of this. He is, I think, the world's most followed mayor on Twitter with more than 1 million followers. And he will on a daily basis engage in conversations with citizens around different public service issues. Within the city, that's led to creating lots of different solutions around in housing blocks, for example. The city has funded citizens to set up a book sharing scheme at the entrance to a housing block. In other cases, they've paired older people who need a bit of care and support around a house but who have spare place, pairing them up with young students who can't afford accommodation in the city. and setting up loads of different schemes initiated by the city, by citizens, and part funded and managed by the city. I can elaborate on all of these in more detail later on. I know it's quite a lot of stuff to take in. The third one, and this is where it gets interesting, is around kind of transforming kind of the process and culture of government. And so I was in Singapore in December last year, or 2 years ago, to meet up with PS21, which stands for Public Services for the 21st Century. I think PS21 has really pioneered the idea of staff-driven innovation and staff-driven solutions. So in the early 90s, the head of the Singaporean civil service realized that there are lots of ideas in public services, but they often come from frontline staff, and they die at middle management level. Apologies to any middle managers on the call now, but there was a big issue around kind of getting all those ideas through to the people who can actually make decisions around spending and implementation. So through PS21, they developed something called the Staff Suggestion Scheme, SSS, which is basically a process where any staff could suggest an idea, and it immediately gets sent to the head of the civil service, and who on a panel evaluates those ideas with civil servants. And through a nice that leads to millions and millions of ideas kind of flowing into the heads of civil service and millions in savings. I think, as I mentioned on the slide there, around £55 million saved in 1 year based on ideas from staff. At the same time, PS21 also tries to kind of implement kind of methods for celebrating kind of innovation in public services. Every year they hold a big event, like a festival, where the best ideas generated through the suggestion schemes are celebrated. And I think across all of these teams, I think it's important to remember that they all try to constantly challenge the way they work and evolve. So the latest addition to PS21 is something called the Post and Poll app, where it's actually in similar style to the Citizens Connect app I mentioned earlier. Every single of the 140,000 staff in the Singaporean public service can take a picture and log an issue they have with public services or an idea they have for improvement, and it will go directly to the heads of their respective departments. The fourth kind of I team are the ones that focus on achieving wider kind of policy and system change, so changing how an entire kind of government department works or how an entire policy is implemented. This, of course, requires quite a lot of resources, and Brenton's waving his hand at me again. This, of course, requires quite a lot of capacity and resource. So Sitra in Finland is a good example of an institution that's got kind of the mandate and the capacity to do this, with more than 400 million euros and quite a big organization, and actually being set up as an independent organization in similar style to Nesta. Sitra is experimenting with setting up an entire alternative healthcare systems in Finland, and then I was presenting these back to the Finnish government as a real alternative to how healthcare can be delivered. Equally, Sitra experiments around sustainable energy, where Sitra pioneered much of sustainable energy and carbon kind of reduction schemes in Finland, is now written into Finnish policy, but only because Sitra as an organization can invest up front 50 to 100 million in big programs that can kind of experiment with entire new systems. So they're kind of like the four types of I teams that we kind of identified in our research. Sophie's now going to try and talk you through what we think are some 10 key lessons from the research for you if you were thinking about setting up an I team within your organization.
Super, thanks, Peter. So Peter's kind of gone through some of the models that we've kind of identified in the report of I teams. And we found that there are a lot of lessons from the report that are applicable to organisations looking to deepen their innovative capacity as they are to governments at all levels. And in our report we outlined 10 recommendations for creating and running a successful innovation team in Albert Fund. And some of these are distilled into a lab practice guide, which Brenton will elaborate on further in a few minutes. So, number one, I guess I'm going to try and keep it brief now because I know we're kind of behind time. So the first point is have clear goals in mind. The type of item you create should be driven by that goal. Often governments who are considering setting up an IT team are enthusiastic. They want to engage citizens and they want to encourage system level change right from the very start. However, we found that the most successful IT teams were incredibly clear about their mission and priorities from the outset. So we recommend you identify your key priorities, develop your skills and expertise around them, and you can always broaden your remit later on. So number two would be forge strong links to executive power. So a good example would be Nesta. almost half our work is kind of co-designed and co-funded with government. And just to kind of explain the rationale behind this, the most effective IT that we've case studied have clearly all four strong linked to executive powers. They leverage internal and external partnerships, resources and insights to achieve goals. And being situated in close proximity to authorising powers, be they mayors or prime ministers, it lends credibility to the team's work and it helps overcome barriers. And at the same time, IT teams will also have to use persuasion as well as power, building partnerships and influencing key stakeholders as to why they should collaborate and engage. So number 3, build a team with a diverse mix of skills. So IT teams kind of need to operate both inside and outside of the system. And staffing is hugely important for IT teams. It's crucial to get the mix right of both skills and experience. Too many insiders and you risk complacency and incrementalism. Too many outsiders and it may be difficult to gain buy-in from key stakeholders. We found the key is to combine insiders and outsiders, balancing a charisma that brings about energy and excitement with strong management skills that will push ideas into implementation. IT leaders need to understand the rhythm of government and they can always bring in design and other skills to support them. As well as recruiting from business, NGOs and academia and from other countries, IT teams can also use networks of associates to be drawn on for particular projects, including specialists in fields like ethnography, data, social psychology or citizen experience. It's worth kind of identifying as well that there aren't always innovations out there, so you have to be ready to train people on the job too. And a good example, which if Brenton would like to elaborate on later, is Taxi. Brenton is the former and founding CEO of Taxi. And when Taxi was kind of being established in Australia, there were very few kind of designers available, available talent in Australia. So in that case, service designers were kind of actually recruited internationally. So number 4 is develop a lean funding model for the team itself and secure funds from partners for implementation. So money obviously matters. IT teams can have their own budgets, but often work better if they have to unlock departmental or agency budgets to fund projects. Some successfully leverage corporate or philanthropic funding, which gives them added clout, and a handful of secured endowments, which allows them to act much longer. The key is to mobilise funds elsewhere in the system rather than trying to accumulate larger budgets, which risks giving the rest of the system an excuse for disengaging. So a nice example here, I won't kind of focus on it for too long, but it's the Centre for Social Innovation in Colombia. And it is part of the Colombian Alliance of Funding Pioneers, and it uses this kind of funding format to leverage corporate funding. And this works to sidestep complex government procurement to more easily develop programs. So number 5, continually demonstrate and communicate the IT team's unique value. IT teams are most likely to be seen as valuable if they bring unique expertise and knowledge that isn't available elsewhere in the system, as well as an ability to unlock money and mobilise political capital. They need to bring distinct insights, for example, into public attitudes and aspirations, and create a culture that is visibly different to the surrounding bureaucracy. Experimental, risk-taking, data-driven, entrepreneurial, and open. The value IT teams bring needs to be communicated to help survive changes in political leadership, and there will be plenty of vested interest keen to see them fail. So the example here of Citra. Citra has been redesigned around 3 times in the fund's lifespan to stay relevant to current challenges in Finland. So 6. Employ explicit methods drawing on cutting-edge innovation skills and tools alongside strong project management to get work done. IT teams are more likely to survive if they use methods that are clearly distinct from normal practices of bureaucracy. An explicit way of working helps mix the team's offer and demystifies the process of innovation. There are plenty of methods to choose from, including design and data, stage-gated funding, and open innovation. Be pragmatic about which ones are most useful, and exercise the healthy skepticism about the evangelists, since most often the most successful of the methods are hybrids of different approaches. Despite their diversity, many of the IT teams share some common approaches, such as moving fast from ideas to demonstrable small-scale prototypes, plenty of measurement and data, and using platforms and challenges to help draw ideas in. All IT teams need to continually develop their methods, setting aside time to reflect, to keep them fresh, relevant, and effective. And a nice kind of model here, a nice demonstration of this would be the New Orleans Innovation Delivery Team. It has a structured 4-step model to apply to all solution development and implementation. So this point is really, really important if you're kind of exploring the idea of an innovation team or a lab or fund yourself. And that is, I-teams really, really need to have a bias towards action and aim for rapid experimentation, combining early wins with longer-term impacts. So all I-teams should have a bias towards action, as I said. New I-teams should move fast to achieve early wins, choosing issues where there's chances of rapid progress are high, and avoiding unnecessary controversy. This will build confidence and legitimacy in the team's work and ability and avoid setting the I-team up to fail. When starting out, I-teams may need to be incubated in an existing organisation to provide a base and back office functions rather than being set up entirely from scratch. Some of the I-teams have lasted a long time, but most have a limited lifespan. The chemistry that makes them work is hard to sustain. The most common unnecessary mistake is to set unrealistically demanding timescales. But it's not necessary to set up I-teams as permanent structures either. Setting an initial timescale of about 3 to 5 years can kind of helpfully focus attention on proving their worth. So the example you see in the corner there is Monum, and it has a rapid prototyping methodology, and it develops solutions in a matter of weeks, and this really helps with this kind of quick win approach. So number 8, be clear on handovers early on, tasking implementation and delivery to government. So once problems are identified and new solutions developed, there needs to be measures taken to ensure they are incorporated into mainstream delivery. Identify your relevant partners in government early on and plan for budgets and legal changes, ideally with named staff responsible for delivery. Track handovers and continue to monitor delivery to make sure project impacts are sustained as the innovation grows. So the French Fund for the Young funds the evaluation of projects and helps government select the most successful to adopt and scale. Number 9, so Peter already kind of talked about the focus on impact measures. And one kind of piece of advice, having looked at research, is relentlessly measure impacts and quantify successes and be sure to stop what isn't working. So a really nice example of this before I kind of explain the rationale behind this would be the NYC Centre for Economic Opportunity. They regularly undertake large complex trials to test different interventions. And the reason they're really, really interesting is that when the evidence is pointing to them actually stopping programs, they do so. And a good example of this would be their Family Rewards program, which is an experimental kind of privately funded cash transfer intervention aimed to help families break cycles of poverty. And it was actually stopped in the end of its pilot phase because their researchers found it had little impact on longer term outcomes, such as academic achievement. So I-teams really, really do kind of try best if they're clear about what they're trying to achieve with a detailed logic model. A logic model and period change. And measurable results can be crucial to winning over skeptics, especially if savings can be quantified. Earlier stage innovations need different proof points than more developed ideas, and the work is bound to be a mix of sprints and marathons, with small triumphs communicated confidently to provide a narrative while bigger impacts inevitably take much longer to achieve. Admit when a project is not working, just as NYC CEO did, and end it. This is just as important as scaling projects that work, and it will build credibility for your team. And we're kind of going to move on now to, sorry, that's just a kind of an overview of the impact measures. And I'll just kind of pause that just for a minute just to see that there is quite a healthy mix there between quantitative and qualitative approaches to impact measures.
I think, yeah, and just say, I think the really important thing is that a lot of the teams, so we did survey, really, really struggles with this. And so if there's something you're worrying about, you're not alone.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to say that this is something that when you start to scale your work, this is the question you get asked, like, what's the real impact? So that early on you can start thinking about how to capture evidence around this. And with Brenton in a bit, I'm going to talk about some of the business model and the canvases you can use to do this, the better. But to fear not, even in Nesta, this is something we often struggle with in programs. Yeah,
certainly. Yeah, so I think it was almost half, as Peter said, that had difficulty with impact measurement. And in some cases there wasn't even an appetite to actually track impact measurement. So this leads us on to the last of the 10 points. And this is a nice kind of point to finish on, and that's celebrate success and share credit. So there's a famous saying that it's amazing what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit. And I-teams certainly kind of can relate to this in a lot of cases. I-teams need to celebrate their impact and create credit for their main sponsors. Tying in leading officials into the team success helps to make them champions and allows them to share some of the glory. But I-teams are likely to succeed best if they can create credit for lots of other stakeholders too, including other officials, partner organisations, people on the front line and the public. Shared credit is a single best guarantee that projects and programmes will be sustained and ultimately delivers more awards to sponsors too. So a nice example will be PS21's annual Excel Award for Best Staff-Driven Innovation Projects in Singapore's public service. And another nice example will be in South Africa, CPSI, that Peter kind of mentioned earlier. They run awards to celebrate and promote innovative ideas across the South African government. So that is the 10 recommendations that we have, and if you're interested and you'd like to explore the case studies a little bit more, I would signpost you towards our report. And just to kind of give you a quick overview of the Nesta, the iteams.org website, you can see kind of details, more detail about actual case studies, and there's other case studies too from people who've actually decided to map themselves. So if you know of any ITs working out there that we're not familiar with, please do kind of put the details in there. So just want to kind of quickly stop for a second about and point you to the OECD Public Sector Innovation Observatory. So it's a useful platform for some of the best examples and shared experiences of public sector innovation and for advice on how to make these innovations work. And my final plug, if I can do this now without running over time, is just to kind of point you all towards Lab Notes, which is our monthly digest of news and tools for public service innovators around the world. And I can send Gina more details about Lab Notes after this. So if you're interested in public sector innovation, which I'm assuming most of you are, I think it's a really useful resource, and I'd kind of encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. So, I mean, Gina, do you think it would be useful for us to have questions now, or to kind of...
Yeah, let's open it up for a round before we switch gears to Brenton's talk about the follow-up, because I think it's worth pausing on a few points. So we'll invite colleagues to post your questions in the chat box. We've seen a few here, which were mainly due to the technical difficulties and not being able to hear. We are getting a couple of comments on difficulty hearing. This is, again, sometimes due to the bad connection, so slow and enunciated is the best way to go forward.
My strength, apologies.
No worries, we all do it. It's no problem. So we've got a question here from Cal Joffres. In cases where I-teams didn't get their own procurement process, how are they working around and with government procurement processes to do prototyping or procuring other services with uncertain outcomes?
That's a good question. I think it varies across different teams. I'll let Brenton come in a bit as well. So some teams are set up with an independent fund. So Nesta is a good example where we're set up with a mandate by government to experiment, and there's almost acknowledgement that we're not part of kind of public sector procurement process. We have an independent endowment to go and do this. And quite a lot of the I-teams have that kind of independent mandate from the beginning, and that's almost been secured by politicians to make sure that they don't get caught into some of the kind of more rich process and risk management. Having said that, then it's really important to understand when you start designing solutions within the I-team, how they can be plugged back into something that can be procured and commissioned, and that's when we come back to the commissioning and the impact measurement point. So, Brenton, I don't know if you do.
Well, just a couple of observations. I mean, one is wherever you can to try and give yourself the maximum amount of flexibility within an I-team to adopt whatever processes that you want to adopt. So, you know, making sure you've got the funding and or the ability to attract, you know, resources, both people and money to do the types of activities you want to do is obviously the desirable situation. And partially because the risk is you don't is having to go through existing processes inevitably adds time. And one thing from my experience, and certainly from a lot of my colleagues who've you know, set these up, and particularly those who had a very short initial time span, 12, 18 months, time's not your friend. And so every time somebody puts you know, an additional process you need to go through to get approval, it's something that is not allowing the IT team to get out of the box quickly, to demonstrate its value, to show how you can get to different solutions by working in different ways. So I guess my first point would be to encourage you, when contemplating the setup of an IT team, is to think about how you can give them that sort of maximum amount of flexibility. The other thing I would say, and certainly we had some experience of this within UNDP, is to actually look structurally at how you can reform procurement practices to create space for this different kind of working. Example was with challenge prizes, which is another methodology that many IT teams have used. We actually helped, we have a Centre for Challenge Prizes here. We worked with the UNDP to design a challenge prize around renewable energy, off-grid renewable energy in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That was a very logistically difficult exercise because the procurement practices didn't readily allow for this to work. But based on the results of that challenge, which worked successfully in the end, they were able to use that to mount an argument for changing the procurement practices to create effectively a new modality called challenge prizes, which was made it much easier for subsequent people to adopt and to use these methods. So give yourself maximal flexibility, and if you can't, if you've got to work within systems, look at how you can evolve those systems over time.
Great, thank you for that. I'm also aware of the difficulties on the UNDP project in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The problem really was, to spend money in the public sector often, you have to go through many hoops to do so, and it's very difficult to justify, a $10,000 cash prize when you don't know who it's going to go to or what it's actually going to go for. so it's sort of, we within the UN and probably many within the government are working within a specific context where it's not as if, someone like the inspired mayor of Seoul is saying, we need to do this, let's suspend all regulations to make it happen. What tends to happen from what I've seen is it's more that you have a few early adopters and kind of renegades who are trying to make things work, and they need to they need to go through all the regular procedures and bureaucratic bureaucratic processes, then show an impact, and then you get to the point where maybe you can adjust policy. So this tends to be the sort of cycle that we're working in at the moment.
Absolutely, and that was exactly what happened with the UNDP. Without having run that challenge prize and proved that you can get to a successful outcome without going down traditional procurement methods, that then gave them the internal proof point to then change policy. So, again, it goes to one of the sort of key roles that Peter identified. Actually, these I teams can actually help to reform structures and processes within institutions. And so actually seeing this as an experimental test bed to try out different methods on behalf of an organization that might want to mainstream this later down the track.
And there is a big part of it, which is trust the process, right? Like trust that new methods can bring you new results. And hopefully one of the things we've done with this research is to say, this is not something that's completely uncharted territory anymore. There are actually governments around the world who kind of demonstrated that applying these methods can develop new solutions that deliver better public services for fewer costs. And I guess if you go back 5-10 years, it would have been an even bigger challenge because you didn't know where those teams were and what they did. And so hopefully we can provide a bit of a helping hand for those looking to set up this kind of work.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. I'm going to group two of them together so that you can answer them in one go because they're kind of two sides to the same coin. One is from Dimitri Belan, who's asking, how can we attract government officials to participate in I-team activities? How do we incentivize them? And the other question is on the other side of the incentive story, those who are threatened by change. So the question is from David South, and the question is, do you have any advice on handling vested interests in the public sector, such as trade unions, professional bodies, etc.? These are groups that may feel threatened by change. So if you can answer questions on the incentives and those who be threatened by change.
So on the first one, which I think is a really good question from Dimitri, I think so. when setting up these teams when recruiting, and Brenton has actually done the recruiting for the IT, we can talk more about this, but it's about identifying those. So I'm Danish, and then we call them fire souls. I don't know what Danish word is, but like those people who are really passionate about public services, and they want to change social care, education, and they have ideas, and they want to lead stuff. You know, you don't go for the people who don't want to drive the process, at least not when you set up the project. So it's about finding those people within your organization who you think can really drive the process.
Sorry, what do you call them? You call them fired souls?
No, I'm from Denmark originally, and there's a Danish word for that, and I don't know what the English word is for.
Okay.
Passionate people in public services who really care and
Right.
want to drive. Don't use my.
Don't use your terminology. Okay, this is not the technical term.
Not necessarily.
Sorry, go ahead.
What's it called in Danish?
Ildsjæl.
Okay.
Anyway, so I think that's kind of how do you incentivize, is that there are lots of people, from my experience, that really want this. And also, it's quite interesting to observe that most people who are led in IT get promoted and have quite amazing careers within public services, because they are seen as people who can drive change, which is particularly important to political leaders in a time where there are fewer resources going around to kind of meet increasing public demand for public services. So I think that's kind of the incentive bit, or some of it. On the vested interest, that is definitely one of the biggest challenges to implementation. I think there's two things. One is, at least in the UK, change is going to happen, and if you look at public services across the board, there are massive cuts and there is massive disruption happening. And I guess one of the kind of quite tough messages is that it's how do you deal with that transformation. There are very few roles within the public services that are kind of secure, and it's almost about kind of creating a new culture where saying to civil servants, you have a role in changing the service that you're within, and here are some opportunities for you. But I think few civil servants will see their role as safe and within kind of the current environment. I think the other one is, of course, this kind of the role of political leadership. So I think Mayor Bloomberg in New York, who's also a sponsor of this research, is a good example of someone who fought quite a lot of battles, sometimes you can discuss whether right or wrong, with big corporates, with unions and so on, to drive through programs and innovations within New York City that upset quite a lot of people that he believed would transform kind of public services and kind of the quality of life for people in the city. Sorry, Brenton, I know you're...
That's right. Yeah, I might just throw a few other thoughts in. In terms of how do you attract government officials, just to echo what Peter said, I think in any sort of system, in any organisation, you can tend to spot the fire souls, the early adopters, the frustrated change makers, those who are very, very biased towards action, willing to try and challenge the status quo, and invariably they make very good candidates to bring into the I teams. The example of taxi in Australia, our first secondee came from the Child Protection Agency, because that was one of the key sort of areas of one of the key domains that we chose to sort of work on. And but she was someone who was very frustrated with the system and was potentially about to leave the system altogether, and this was a chance to harness, if you like, her passion and her frustration with the system and channel it towards coming up with better solutions. She's actually now incidentally the CEO of Taxi, so she's continued in this vein. So I think the key thing here is having a very keen radar for people. You can't attract the vast bulk of people all at once. So actually look for the energy, look for the passion, and look for the potential. And then as you go forward and you build those proof points, and people feel a little bit more comfortable with the process and the methodology and the results that these I teams have created, you can then sort of expand the pool of people that you draw in. Tackling the second one in terms of having vested interests, this is it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge in any kind of change management task. It's even more so the case when you're effectively coming up with things you don't yet know what the ultimate outcome is going to look like. I think Machiavelli had something to say about this about 500 years ago. From my experience and sort of again talking to lots of colleagues over the last few years, there is a bit of an art and craft to this rather than a science. Some of it's about starting small and keeping yourself reasonably under the radar while you're getting your sort of initial thoughts together. And aligned to this is sort of under-promising and over-delivering. It's very difficult when you've got politicians who want to show how innovative they are by having a massive launch and talking about how clever they are before these teams have delivered a single thing, and that actually makes life even harder for the people trying to set up and run those labs. So if you can resist that temptation to lead with your chin with the announcements, but actually just get these things up and running and start to sort of build some track record, I think that's really good. But then conversely, the other risk is you stay small, you stay under the radar, and then you can actually get squashed. And we've had examples of this with some I teams that weren't in the report, that weren't given enough time, didn't get the publicity, didn't get that momentum, didn't actually demonstrate the value proposition, which I think was one of the lessons that Sophie talked about. And as a consequence, they were easily shut down. So there's a sweet spot and an acute sense of timing from when you should stay small and under the radar, but then when you really need to open up, to connect up, to engage, and to make sure that it's really enmeshed and embedded, and the value proposition is very visible, such that people aren't inclined to try and shut it down. But again, you're trying to find those proof points. If it's trade unions, you're actually you're trying to give them an opportunity to engage in that process, to see the difference. And my last point, sorry, Peter, is at its heart, many people are motivated to get into public services because they want to see good outcomes for citizens. And in my experience, one of the great joys of working in this is actually helping people reconnect to that sense of vocation about the kind of impact they can create for citizens if they've been trapped in I guess, more bureaucratic and less impactful activities. This can actually help them re-energize.
And just to follow on from that, I think this thing about the value proposition, it's really important to stress. So one of the teams I interviewed talks about how when they went to kind of becoming public about some of the projects, they talked about what's the value add and how can we make a petition to citizens who are going to consume these services. And that's about kind of, you'll have better public service, it'll be easier, smarter. Then there's, what does it mean for civil servants? How is this going to make their work easier to do, less stressful, and how are they going to have high impact? And thirdly, how does this fit in with the political agenda? You kind of need to think about all those three parameters when making a value proposition, because things are only going to get implemented and go to scale if you can convince all those three audiences about the value of your work, which is a tough challenge, but that's when you really get it right. That's, I guess, the sweet spot that you talked about.
Great. So let's follow up this question where you've opened the door to the political agenda with a question from Dada Kadoda. She's asking, are there case studies where citizens push forward public innovation in places where there are weak and unaccountable governments?
That's great. I think not in this study, because this study looks at kind of the teams within the governments who are kind of driving the process. Having said that, I lead in another big project around digital social innovation, and a lot of our work around social innovation is around grassroots civic movements that are creating public services or public value outside kind of the established system, and at some point that kind of gets adopted by the system. A lot of work around healthcare, for example, shows that, where you have people who have overcome living with mental health issues, who provide peer support to each other outside the traditional treatment system, and so on. So there's lots of examples of that. I think that's almost about kind of giving me like a particular sector you're interested in. Brenton, you had the point as well.
Yeah, I mean, so an actual case study is the guys at the Co-Creation Hub in Lagos in Nigeria. I mean, I think I recall seeing a presentation from them a few years ago, and one of their early slides was actually showing where Nigeria sat on the sort of corruption index or something like that. I mean, this is a fairly weak and unaccountable government. The response, a bit like Peter sort of set out, has been effectively not to try and innovate through the state, but almost to innovate around and despite and in parallel with the state. And so a lot of their work has gone into mobile solutions that have basically been drawn up with the community, with social entrepreneurs, and I guess the philosophy is, we can't expect, we can't sit here and wait for the state to do this for us, and we're not really sure that actually they're an effective partner to do it with, so we might just do it on our own.
Yeah, just to say as well, like I guess one thing that you might find from the report, where it's developing or emerging economies, definitely I think NGOs and third sectors kind of fill that space. So it's kind of up to them to make those linkages and use that kind of creative impulse that we find that ITs are kind of capitalizing on as well. So.
Great, thank you. This is really useful. I think one of the additional points is that, in those cases where it's citizens who are, as you say, innovating around and despite of the state, an incentive for states to support this kind of work is really that this is a much more constructive way of approaching the citizen-state relationship than, of course, other means. So any kind of constructive, pragmatic problem-solving, on the one hand, it should be encouraged because it's not protests and other forms of communicating dissent. But on the other hand, sometimes they get to a scale where eventually, ideally, you want the government to also claim success, and as you're saying, share the credit. If you can get to that point where there is that trust between the citizen groups and the government, then you're again moving to that sweet spot that you're talking about. Let's move to a technical question here about shared ownership of innovation labs. This question is from Christina Lissi. In cases of innovation labs with shared ownership, what are the ways labs use to balance different agendas of different actors, sort of private sector, public sector, etc.? Do you have any cases like that where you have shared ownership of a lab? Have we? It sounds very quiet. Maybe you don't. Maybe there are more cases.
For a moment.
We missed you just after Sophie's reply. I don't know if you...
Oh, okay. All right. So you didn't hear the question. Okay. The question is from Christina Lissi, and the question is about shared ownership of innovation labs. Whether you've come across any cases like this where you need to balance different agendas of the actual owners of the innovation lab, whether it's across private or public sector.
Yeah, so I guess two good examples of that. One is MindLab in Denmark, which I of course have a strong connection to. So MindLab is set up and owned by 3 different government departments and 1 local authority. And I guess when you interview MindLab about this relationship, in one way, so the way it's been set up is that they try to split their work across the different ministries, but also they try to find ways where the different ministries have a joint agenda and develop products on the back of that. And of course, in that way, MindLab often becomes a kind of a motor for driving collaboration across government, which can often be very, very siloed. So that's one, but it's often about kind of that governance structure. Often this MindLab talks about being a big strength for them because it means that they have buy-in to lots of different parts of government, which unlike any other department where they kind of exist in those silos. Another example is Region 27 in France. I don't know if you're familiar with them, and they weren't on our slides here. So they call it the 27th region because there were 26 regions in France, and the region 27 considers them the 27th region. They're jointly owned by all the different French regions to help try and drive innovation within regions. And the way they manage that partnership is that the regions provide a bit of core funding for the team of 4 to kind of run and develop some general thinking around innovation in the regions. But then if you want to work in more detail with them, you then do project by project funding from each independent region. But on the board and governance of Region 27, you have 4 presidents and 4 vice presidents of regions in France, which help them really tap into what the political agenda is and make sure that Region 27 is always really close to the political kind of drive within France. So that makes sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. So we've got one question here, which is about, this is from a colleague in the room here, Eva Kaplan from UNICEF. Are there any lessons or differences on labs supporting city versus national government? Is one more effective than the other? And are there different recommendations related to different levels of government?
I would say it's probably almost easier to, well, I would say it is easier to run a lab within a city because you are in many ways closer to citizens and you have more, you have a narrower focus in terms of the public service areas you focus on. Also, you have a bigger mandate to conduct experiments in the city. And so the Barcelona Urban Lab, one of the case studies in the report, is a good example of where the city has said we need more entrepreneurs to develop civic solutions or solutions for the city, and said we don't have a lot of money, but we have the city as a space, and you can come in as a business and do an experiment on the streets, on our bins, on our lampposts. And I think because you have a close proximity between citizens and the city and entrepreneurs, you can create stronger kind of relationships around doing experiments. And of course, you don't have, at least in most cities, responsibility for health and social care, which is one of the biggest public service challenges. So I think that there's a kind of clear difference there. And we're doing quite a lot of work in Nesta now around kind of social innovation in cities and how cities can drive not just kind of top-down solutions, but also work with citizens to improve kind of urban environments. So, but I don't know if you had anything to...
No, I mean, I'd sort of echo that. I mean, Taxi was effectively a national centre, but we were based in Adelaide, and so we very much did a lot of our experimentation at the city level, but with an eye on sort of national priorities. I think the risk, if you start at the national level, is you can kind of find yourself trying to deal with, you know, comprehensive sort of policy domains, which can get very, you know, at one level it's systemic, but at the other hand it can be very sort of disconnected from actually getting down to the ground and working with citizens and thinking about how things might work. So if you are going to do a national thing, I think you need to resist the temptation of staying within your sort of central government agencies and really getting out into the field and testing things out.
And yeah, because I guess one of the things, that particularly kind of the early stage of innovation, where you do a lot of prototyping and piloting, it needs to be in a place, and the sense of place and almost like a hub for doing this often helps drive the process and brings people together around something very tangible, like a street or a region or something. So even in Sitsal, which is trying to do stuff on behalf of Finland, each project will kind of be focused on a particular town or a particular city in Finland, which becomes the place to test if this works, and if it works, then they will then scale up across Finland. So I think these things will almost always start, not even in cities, but on streets. So I think the more micro the earlier stage you are in the process, I think the benefit, of course, of being a national I-team is the mandate to scale things up. Because cities, from my experience, often don't have an interest in going beyond, well, the city.
And one way of squaring the circle, and we tried proposing this in Australia, and we didn't succeed, is actually to look at having a federated model. So actually having a number of labs within, so you effectively have a national system of labs or I-teams that are made up of different locations, and they might have different specialties, or they may sort of pick different parts. You know, one may focus on sort of data methods, others may focus on design, or one may focus on sort of, you know, crime and justice, others may focus on sustainable communities, but with a view that you're sharing the learnings across those. So in a way you can kind of have more experiments, but doing so in an open, shared fashion. So if we could see that happen anywhere, I think that would be a really big advance in this space.
And final comment, I think it's also really important to remember that we study Seoul as one case study, and that's technically a city, but it's bigger than Denmark, which is where we have MindLab, which is responsible for innovating on behalf of government.
And I'm not sure that question came from UNICEF, but I mean, certainly I think the way that Chris and Eric have been promoting innovation labs within UNICEF, I think is a really good example of how you can have that sort of distributed learning model, have lots of different experiments, but with a view that if things work, it gets shared within the sort of network and can be applied in multiple locations.
So we've had such an overwhelming round of questions, Brenton. I realized that I've totally mismanaged the time. And we were meant to hear from you about some of the follow-up to the report, particularly your work with the Do-It-Yourself Toolkit. We have a couple more really interesting questions and about 10 minutes left. Would you promise to do another webinar with us about the DIY Toolkit if we focus on answering the questions instead?
Yeah, I think that would be, I think that's fine. I mean, we can send links out to these documents and people can kind of have a read through them. They're reasonably self-explanatory, But yeah, more than happy to have a follow-up conversation purely on that. Let's stick with the questions.
Okay, thank you. My apologies. It was an overwhelming amount of questions, and I really didn't moderate efficiently. But let's. So we have a couple more interesting questions, and then we'll close this out in a few minutes. We have a question here about are there experiences with networked innovation involving various innovation teams, for example, at the national level, or is innovation complex enough without adding networking challenges? This question is from Manuel Acevedo.
Well, as I just mentioned, I think the UNICEF example, which has, I think, at last count, 11 labs. It might have grown since I last spoke to Erica and Chris, where there is a real sense of trying things out in lots of locations with a view that if things work, then that gets spread across that network. It's probably one of the better examples that I'm familiar with. I mean, I know the UNDP within sort of Eastern Europe has done a lot to kind of share its learning at a regional level, but probably not formalized as a network of teams and labs.
Just another kind of network of labs that comes to mind would be Nesta's actually, so Lab Notes is actually the combination of a few different labs that come together. So there's Gov Lab in America, we have Mars Solutions Lab in Canada, Mind Lab that Peter has mentioned in Denmark, and a couple of others as well. So it's kind of a loose coordination of these different labs coming together. And there is going to be a global labs gathering yet to be kind of fully confirmed, but at some point in the summer, which is kind of the aim is to kind of bring together some of these key questions that these different network kind of groups have.
And just on the complexity point, I think it's really important to stress that networks need facilitators. They rarely grow by themselves. And from the cases we looked at, people are so bogged down in making the lab itself and its process work and getting political buy-in. They're trying to move beyond kind of that and trying to network across that would be a whole other challenge. I think there is some movement in Europe around trying to create some networks between kind of public sector innovation labs.
The European Network of Living Labs is another example.
Yeah, exactly.
Might be worth having a look at.
And of course, there's loads of kind of more grassroots civil society, like Fat Labs, for example, which is more of a kind of very kind of loosely organized global movement around kind of the maker movement, which I guess is an example of something that drives public and private sector value in kind of a network lab fashion. But there's no public sector around the UNICEF example.
No, and I think the example of the Fab Labs and the UNICEF Labs and others, I think, drives this point, which is for the network to be effective, there needs to be probably a reasonably tight focus so that there's actually enough commonality to actually share, useful experience and learning.
So I think a good example of a type of cooperation is that the Family by Family project that Brenton helped develop at Taxi in Australia is now something that MindLab is trying to take to Denmark. And it's two different labs, and they aren't in a what you call official network, but they are both have a job to create and understand also what is the kind of international best practice, and then trying to be the adopters and disseminators of that practice. And I think that should be the job of any kind of innovation team, and they don't have to be any kind of official partnership to do that.
Great, thank you. All right, so we've got Manuel is saying great, thanks, going through the chat line. So thank you for that. So we'll take this last question, and then I'll give the floor over to you in case you want to have any kind of concluding remarks. This is a question from Wigdan Seed Ahmed. And the question is really, it's one that I've actually thought about, and if any of you have read the book, The Circle, I think it came out this summer, it kind of touches on this. But, when you were talking about the example of people taking pictures of graffiti and government sort of following up to clean it up, it does open the door to questions about sort of Big Brother watching. So Wigdan's question is really, how do you make sure that that the public role here is one for citizens' benefit instead of sort of spying or monitoring social media activities? So any experience or thoughts on that side of the coin?
So yeah, I was going to say I lead a lot of projects that are exploring different dimensions of this, and this is a constant issue because on one end there's a huge opportunity to tap into social media and citizen kind of collective intelligence social media to do a lot of public goods. But we also know that can easily be abused. And I think there's something there around kind of standards law and code of conduct. I think if cities doesn't tap into some of the best practices around technology and tapping into kind of consumer knowledge using technology, we're missing one of the tricks in terms of the huge opportunity for innovation. But I think the whole debate on privacy is something that we barely need to start kind of touching the surface of, and I don't know what the final answer is to that, but I know it's a kind of it's an ongoing debate. I don't know what the definitive answer is. Sorry, but I don't know if you've got an opinion on that.
Well, no. I mean, I think I think at the end of the day, most innovations can be, they can be sort of ethically neutral, and it's about kind of the sort of ethics and philosophy that you bring to this. And that's where I think the sort of the public value, the public sector ethos is a really important thing not to lose sight of with any of these sort of new technological potentials and approaches.
Yeah, and I think there's also something around kind of finding a better balance between kind of what is public knowledge, and that's both public knowledge on kind of from the citizen perspective. So what will citizens share with other citizens and the public sector, but also what should the public sector share with citizens? Because the flip side of this is that there's loads of innovation that's being held back because public services won't share all the basic knowledge it has around how it spends money, where it has its assets, who it partners with, which we know that loads of the digital innovators kind of use to drive and develop new services. So there's also the other one around kind of how can we actually get government to open up and be less private around data it holds. Of course, not on citizens, but on kind of on public services. And again, this project I mentioned around digital social innovation has lots of examples of public services that have led this kind of process, which has led to lots of different innovations being developed around citizens better understanding the city, finding free food around the city, getting better traffic apps, and so on. But this is something that in all matters of our lives, I think would be a huge issue over the next years.
Great, thank you so much. So let me just give a round of 3 kind of takeaways from my side, and then we'll hand over to you guys for closing remarks. So especially appreciated your advice on sort of forming innovation teams and keeping the diversity between insiders and outsiders. This is very, very useful, and also the balance between different skill sets. So those in design, in the social sector, and in business. Very useful piece of advice. My second takeaway would be the point about finding this sweet spot between letting innovation kind of bubble under the radar and fail and modify and get rid of things that aren't working and all of that, versus kind of going with the big bang visible approach where you're really selling the value proposition of the work. And the third one I think is a really good piece of advice, especially when teams are ready to go public and share what they've been doing in a sort of positive and credit sharing kind of way, is really to think of the 3 different constituents and agendas that you need to sell to. So first is, of course, citizens and making their life easier, making public service more accessible to their lives. Secondly are the civil servants. So how do you make their work less stressful, easier, more rewarding? And the third to keep in mind always is the broader political agenda. So especially given that many of these teams are close proximity to executive power, obviously the political concerns and not just showing results, but showing results in a way that is politically viable is really key. So those would be my 3 takeaways. Let me just hand over to you all for some closing words.
Well, thanks for that, Gina. I think you've done a very good job at hitting on some of the sort of the key themes that have come through. I guess maybe just by way of sort of adding my own personal reflections on this as somebody who set one of these teams up 6 years ago. When I was starting to put together the business plan for Taxi, there was a lot less guidance and far fewer examples out there in the field, and we have seen an explosion of these teams around, and from that, examples and learnings, and commend the work of the iTeams report as a great sort of summary of the state of play, and there's a lot there to mine and to sort of draw inspiration from for people listening to this and reading the report. Key message for me: clearly there is no single model. There's no magic bullet, there's no algorithm here, but what there are there's some common lessons, and again, the lessons that recommendations that Sophie highlighted, I think that's a really good sort of threads that come through almost in, in many, many situations. There are some key strategic choices that need to be made, choices around method, around team, and around funding and the relationship with power. And then just in terms of for people who are thinking about embarking on this, learn from others, definitely. But whatever you do, bring your own individual flair and your own sensitivity to the context that you're working in. Actually, we don't, when we do the next report of this in 5 years' time, we don't want a bunch of clones out there. We actually want a much more diverse ecosystem where people are taking these lessons and, learning what works in their particular circumstance. And then finally, which I think Peter touched on, is my experience coming into the space is full of very, very generous people, generous with their time, with their mistakes, with their connections, and I'd encourage anyone who's sort of going into this space to continue with that sort of ethos of sharing and connecting and being very open and candid. This is an emerging space. No one has the answers, not even us, especially not us. But I think if we can continue to sort of to create that honest space for the learning and sharing, then we can actually move this field forward.
Yeah, so Brenton basically covered my 2 main points as well, but I was just going to say, I think it's almost a good and a bad thing about our report is that in 2 years' time it will be completely out of date because this field is so rapidly evolving. So I think, and as part of that, I think it's important that you learn from the lessons from some of these teams, but also stay alert and keep kind of observing what's happening out there. Not a week goes by where we're not approached by a new team that's trying new stuff. And I kind of echo Brenton's, like, do what works for you, because that works great. Local ownership, which is what drives us in the long term. If it's about kind of taking what someone else has done, often people don't want to see it through. So I think really focus on kind of your culture, your context, your political kind of context, and make stuff work. And then just a huge thank you for all of you for signing up for this. It's been really interesting and some amazing questions, which highlight that this is definitely an agenda that should be explored more by some good research.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you all so much for this. And we will make the recording available. And please do have a look at the iTeams website, which has the report, but also the platform for mapping new iTeams that are sprouting up all the time. And Brenton, we will hold you to your follow-up webinar on the DIY toolkit.
That's good.
All right. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Cheers.